changes that were taking place in terms of titles within the government were both cosmetic and important. First of all, take a look at some of these men. Well, one of the things you notice right off the bat is that many of them came directly from the early Stalin years in Georgia. So we have everybody from Maxim Litvinov to Clement Voroshilov, Michael Kalinin, Sergo Orzanikits, Joseph Stalin himself, that had actually been involved in the bank robbing, or organization of the funds that Lenin needed to publish his Iskra newspaper, and now they're sitting in the government as what would normally have been called ministers. These ministers are now called commissars, and the chairman of the National People's Council, or Soviet, is what would have been a prime minister. Well, Lenin is now the chairman of the people's government, and he is supported by ministers, all of whom are Bolshevik Party members. So from this point forward, it's a little difficult to differentiate decision-making between the government itself and decision-making within the Bolshevik Party Central Committee's political bureau. The Seizure Committee has been changed into a political committee that has 7 members, and the rest of them have gone back to their Central Committee jobs of one kind or another. So you have that new party structure going on. We discussed one of the meetings just a minute ago that had the formation of the Chika, the Extraordinary Commission for the Suppression of Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation. The speculation had to do with finances, and so they had abolished the capitalist stock market, and they were now making all of that kind of financial activity illegal. Everything was being transferred to a new council which would be in charge of finances and so forth. Well, the name changes were cosmetic changes. In terms, ministers are now commissars. The chairman of the government of People's Commissars was what you would have called prime minister. So these are changes, but of cosmetic nature, but they were also important because they reaffirmed to the Bolsheviks themselves and told the rest of the country that this is a new kind of government. These guys are after completely different things than what we're used to, which is a government of thieves. That's what every capitalist government has been up until now, and it's just one group of thieves replacing another at the trough. So both these are cosmetic changes, but they're important. There's something else I want to mention that's going on in 1918, and that is individuals that will later become very important begin to emerge in the course of the Civil War. We mentioned one, Mikhail Frunze, who led the armed struggle for the seizure of Minsk, and then moved his armed forces up to Moscow to participate in the several-week-long armed struggle for the control of Moscow after the success of the Petrograd coup against Kerensky. Another one is Semyon Budeny. Now, Budeny was a cavalry officer who had been with Stalin in the Caucasus, and now he was in charge of the Red Army's cavalry. Another was a man named Vasily Blucher. Blucher would become very important because he was going to lead the Chinese liberation armies in a few years for Lenin. But at this particular moment, he was a Red Army commander with, who was having a great deal of success during the course of the Civil War. Another was an army sergeant named George Zhukov. Now, the Bolsheviks had abolished ranks in the army immediately, that is, in the first few days of their formation of the government. But that in and of itself was a campaign promise that they had to keep. On the other hand, now they were having to govern, and that meant that, they, among other things, they had to have a real armed forces with real discipline, real real officers and NCOs and ranks. So what they did was Trotsky reintroduced ranks with new names, so that rather than having hereditary ranks that could run everywhere from lieutenant to general, you now had ranks that were named after, for example, a platoon commander would be a name for what had been a lieutenant. A company commander would be the name for what had been a captain. A regimental commander, the name for somebody that had been a major, and so on. So they changed the names of all of these officers and NCOs. They reduced the significance of their insignias down to something like you might see on a Star Trek show, where you'd have a little collar star or something like that that would indicate that this guy is an officer or an NCO. And then they appointed political officers, which was a new idea, for every command officer. So you had two things running that the Bolsheviks controlled. One was the officer class itself, and NCO class, non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals, in other words, for those of you who may not be familiar with the terminology. Sergeants and corporals are called non-commissioned officers. Now, they also had political officers for every one of these guys. Well, what was the point of that? Well, the point was our political officers are absolute 100% grade A Bolsheviks politically, but they may not know jack about combat. So conversely, these combat-trained officers may be very good at what they do technically, but they're politically unreliable. So they solved both problems. Now, to be a political officer, you first of all had to be a Bolshevik party member. And then secondly, it wasn't long before the Cheka under Dzerzhinsky introduced the idea of political officers also being Chekas. So you had a triple line of control over the armed forces, and this made this huge army that Lenin was building an absolutely reliable instrument. Otherwise, you could be confronted with the same thing the Czar had been confronted with. Every time the troops get pissed off about something, they may revolt, and then where are you going to be? Well, in this case, there isn't going to be any revolt, because the political officers have the authority to shoot any command officer anytime they feel like doing it. And more and more of those political officers are being brought directly over from the secret police, so they're really well indoctrinated, and they have a special line of control. You don't have to worry about the army anymore. As a consequence, Lenin is able to build this 300,000 man army he inherited into 5.5 million men by 1922. Now, that made it by far the biggest standing army in the world in 1922, and no way that any capitalist country, whether it be Japan or the US, Germany, France, England, or Italy, were going to be able to challenge the Russian army in any serious way, especially when you consider that the peoples in all of these countries were sick of the World War, and they just wanted their boys to come home. So there was no appetite for war among the masses in these capitalist countries, and no ability, therefore, for their bosses to intervene effectively in the Russian Civil War any longer. So as his army kept growing, it also kept getting a stronger and tighter central control. And they, as we've seen by the end of 1918, they brought everything under control. Now, in terms of the domestic economy, with the triumvirate that they appointed. Now, at the first international in 1919 meeting, early part of 1919, Lenin wanted all of these internationalists to go home and do at home what they had done already here in Russia. And what he did, so that his speech there is really important, because the very first thing he says is that I'll just read it to you. He says, quote, "Our victory was made easier by the fact that the October 1917 that in October 1917 we marched with the farmers, with all the farmers. In that sense, our revolution was a bourgeois revolution. The first step taken by our proletarian government was to embody in a law promulgated on October 26th, old style, November 7th, new style, 1917, on the next day after the revolution, the old demands of all the farmers which farmers' soviets and village assemblies had put forward under Kerensky, who, as you recall, is the man that Lenin overthrew. That is where our strength lay. That is why we were able to win the overwhelming majority so easily. As far as the countryside was concerned, our revolution continued to be a bourgeois revolution, and only later, and then he goes on to explain how it became more proletarianized. But he wants them to understand that they were successful at the very beginning because they made an alliance between the world's most authentic, orthodox working class party and the mass of Russians who were capitalist farmers, big or small. Now, that was just, now they've confronted many things. They've gone from, it's one thing to make campaign promises, it's another thing to find yourself in government and actually have to govern. So the ranks in the army is one example. They abolished those ranks because they had to, that was one of their campaign promises, and then reintroduced them because they had to if they wanted to have an effective military machine. But as a concession to themselves, they reintroduced them with all of these conditions, like from now on an officer will be an officer based upon what his job is, not on inherited rank, or an NCO for that matter. And everybody will be subject to political officers, so there won't be any question about whether they follow the orders of the center. And furthermore, just to be sure these political officers don't get off on to their own, we're going to have them controlled largely by the Chika itself, that is our secret police. So these were the ways in which they had to confront the issues of the fact that they're now in power and that campaign promises have to be fulfilled at the same time, fulfilled in such a way that will allow them to do what they have to do. And what is that? Well, they have to retain state power. Now, this is going to be the key question in 1918, 1919, and 1920. Now, so when Zhukov was appointed as a sergeant, that's why you can see that the ranks really hadn't been changed. They just changed the names. So this happened in 1920. He was a young man, obviously. He had just worked his way out of being a private soldier and now had been promoted to being a sergeant. Zhukov is eventually going to be head of all of the armies of the Soviet Union for Stalin. But at this particular time, he's working for Budeni. Now, Budeni is another Stalinist from the old days in Georgia. So we can pretty well see that Zhukov is growing up as a person in the Stalin faction of the party. What does that mean exactly? Well, what it means is that the majority of the party is following the party manager, Stalin, because he's there by the fact that he's been there doing this kind of thing since the very earliest days of Bolshevism, and because Lenin wants him there doing this sort of thing, and it's just kind of natural for all of these fellows to fall in line as Stalinists. Trotsky as a political factor, I don't think is yet serious within the Bolshevik Central Committee because they don't take him seriously. The only guy that really wanted him there is the only guy that still really wants him there, and that's Lenin. As far as Stalin is concerned and the rest of them within the party, Trotsky's kind of an unnecessary nuisance who shoots his mouth all the time and gives the people the impression that he's the boss and the brains behind everything, which has really reacted against him because it's alienated people like Frunze, and for that matter, people like George Zhukov, who's just become a general, and a sergeant. All of these guys that are working their way up. So he doesn't really have much of a mass base within the Red Army itself. Now the worst part is about to develop, and that is in 1920, the Polish situation emerges again. Well, what is that? Well, Poland has been full of reactionaries for a long time, as well as revolutionaries. Many of the Bolsheviks originally came out of Poland, or had a Polish background of some time. But so did an awful lot of reactionary Polish army officers. So in the summer of 1920, the new government in Poland makes an offensive drives into Russia. Well, that was a serious mistake, because what it did was to give Lenin an excuse to re-enter the Polish Civil War, and what he was really looking for was a way back to Berlin. And Warsaw is only a hop and a skip and a jump from Berlin. So all of a sudden what we have here is the Red Army knocking back these Polish forces to their own frontiers and preparing for a massive drive that which will not only take Warsaw, but will put them in Berlin. Now if you do this, you're going to have a powerful working class ally, because the workers in Germany are strongly pro-Bolshevik. They are the ones that brought about the collapse of the Kaiser's government to begin with by forming these Soviets, or workers' councils, soldiers' councils, sailors' councils, all over the country. And Lenin would like to link up with them. So, with this fellow Pilsudski, who has launched the Polish attempt against Russia, has really just given them an excuse. He's opened the door to for the Red Army to come in there and kick his ass, which is what should have happened. Well, what did happen? Well, the Red Army offensive against Warsaw was also an offensive against Germany, so it had two wings. One was a wing that went more or less directly from the Moscow area in a straight line toward Warsaw, and was supposed to divide in two, so that it would have a northern hook that would come down from the north, and that was going to be cavalry from the 2nd Red Cavalry Army, and it was going to attack Warsaw from the north. That was under the generalship of a new guy named Gaia. Then the main body of the thrust that was coming out of Moscow was going to confront Pilsudski's forces in Warsaw and defeat them there in a head-on conflict, the way it had been doing against his forces as they had marched up to the gates of Warsaw. At the same time, that cavalry attack was coming down from the north. Now, the left-wing pincer of this move of the Red Army was commanded by Stalin, who was using Budini, who, as his chief cavalry army officer, Budini was in command of the 1st Red Cavalry Army, which was also called Konarmia, K-O-N-A-R-M-I-A. Now, they were moving against the Polish city of Lvov, L-V-O-V. Another way of spelling it is L-W-O-W, but you see a lot of talk about this right now because there's been a focus on what's going on in Eastern Europe because of the Ukrainian situation. But at any rate, at this time, Lvov was in Poland. Now, what Stalin was intending to do was to hit Lvov and then move on to Berlin from that direction, while Tukhachevsky's forces moved from Warsaw on Berlin from that direction. Well, what actually happened was that Gaia missed his left turn when he was north of Warsaw, and he kept going, and he ended up in Germany with his rear being occupied by white Polish and German forces, and he was forced to surrender. Well, that was one bad thing that happened, but that in and of itself might not have changed everything. What did happen was that Tukhachevsky, who was driving the main body onto Warsaw proper, left a big gap between his men and Stalin's right flank of about 50 miles. Now that's a lot of distance, especially in those days. So Pilsudski and his officers, included French and British advisors, saw the fact that Tukhachevsky's left was unprotected, and they had a distinct advantage. They were sitting right there. Pilsudski was sitting right there on top of his men. He had nowhere to go. But Tukhachevsky, who was in command of this whole, actually the whole thing, for Trotsky, but especially of this main drive from Moscow, was in Minsk all this time, which is 250, 300 miles away from the battlefront. So he wasn't right there, and he should have been. Now, and Trotsky, of course, all this time was in Moscow, bitching about not getting what he wanted. So what happened was that the Pilsudski forces and their advisors which by now included Charles de Gaulle, who would later become important in French history, as you know. They decided to attack Tukhachevsky's left, and they sent a strong flanking attack in. And of course it ran in through open territory. There was a complete gap between Stalin's right and Tukhachevsky's left, and they walked right through it and hit the Russian columns on their flank. And this threw panic into the Red Army forces that were right there in front of Warsaw. Now, Trotsky, seeing that his whole Tukhachevsky offensive up in the north is going to collapse, now demands that Stalin send Budeny to rescue Tukhachevsky. Budeny's a Konarmia. And Stalin said, go fuck yourself. I'm not sending anything up there. You created this mess. Get yourself out of it. So Trotsky goes to Lenin, and he bitches and moans and pisses and groans, and pretty soon Lenin gets in touch with Stalin. We have all the telegrams going back and forth between Lenin and Stalin, and recorded telephone conversations. So we know that initially Lenin told Stalin to obey Trotsky, and Stalin said, no, I won't. So as far as I can tell, this is the first time that Stalin and Lenin had ever disagreed about anything, and this is not a fight Stalin could win. Nobody tells Lenin no. So eventually Lenin talked him out of it, and he agreed to send Budeny to do what he could to rescue Tukhachevsky forces. But by the time Budeny got there, he found the situation hopeless. He did what he could, but he didn't want to get into a situation from which he could not extricate himself. So he managed to get most of his Konarmia back to Stalin's front that was still heading for Lvov. And that was the end of the Polish campaign. The Bolsheviks decided that they would accept Pilsudski's suit for peace. They sued for peace. They gave up quite a bit of territory that they had gained in order to get peace, but finally, by the end of the summer of 1920, the war in Russia was over for practical purposes. So that when Lenin addressed the party in September, he took full responsibility for the failure at Warsaw. And it's interesting to me that he had to know that Trotsky had fucked that whole thing up. But he took the responsibility on his own shoulders and explained that the decision had been right to begin with, because the opportunity had been there for the Red Army to drive directly to Germany. It hadn't worked out, but at any rate, it was time to move on. So, in a sense, he kind of saved Trotsky at that particular moment from what might have happened otherwise. Now, I want to just skip here a little bit later. We've gone through this December 20th meeting in 1917. It wasn't December 17th, it was December 20th, where the Cheka is formed. I won't have to go over that again. Now we've got quite a new situation. For the first time, even though the Soviet Republic is not recognized by any of the great powers in the Western world, it at least is not under direct attack. Now we're talking about September 1920. Eventually, the last imperialist troops, the Japanese in 1922, will be withdrawn. But there's still a lot of mopping up that the Soviet government has to do on both fronts, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean on the one hand, and then the Western Front on the other hand, and that takes them through the rest of 1921, 1922. Now, something else that has changed here. This party, you'll recall, started out as a party of civilians who had adopted a military organization in terms of discipline within their own ranks, but they were either intellectuals or industrial workers. And that was their background. Now we've been through 2.5 years of intensive civil war following the revolution, and we have an army of 5.5 million men, and the Bolshevik leaders have all long since gone into uniform. They've also gotten used to the whole idea of a command economy. In other words, the party has completely changed. It has grown up because of the revolution and the Civil War itself and all the conditions that were imposed on it. Well, what does command economy mean? Well, in practice, the Red Army had taken over running everything. And of course, they used it to satisfy their needs for weapons and supplies, first of all. And now the real question confronting the Soviet government is going to be, can we retain state power? First thing you do to retain state power is you're going to have a modern and competent Army, Navy, Air Force, and secret police. The problem is that this stuff is very expensive. And in the next lecture, I'm going to go through the details of the Soviet finances from the first days of the Lenin's government, right up until 1928, when we have the beginning of what is called the Second Revolution in Russia. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of that first, and then we'll go through it year by year when we take a look at the budget each year that the party had to approve. Remember now, we have an all-Bolshevik government, so party Central Committee and Political Bureau decisions and meetings are just as important, if not more so, than government official meetings that are taking place. You have to make a differentiation in them because the party gives the government its orders, but then the government is responsible for carrying them out. Now, the first head of government is Lenin. He'll be succeeded by a man named Rykov, who will eventually be succeeded by Molotov. But at the same time Lenin was the first head of government, he was also head of the Bolshevik Party. Now, in 1924, Lenin dies in the end of January, and we see the beginning of the de facto rise of Stalin as his replacement, which wasn't immediately apparent. And we'll just talk about that a little bit before we conclude today's lecture, because it sets the basis for understanding how the next 4 or 5 years of Soviet government development evolved. Now, at the time that Lenin died, the leadership mantle passed to the collective leadership of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee, of which there were now 6 people, and a 7th one would have to be elected. 6 because Lenin had died. 3 of these people, Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, had been voting together, and they continued to vote together. And what that meant in practice was that they were going to be the practical successors collectively to Lenin's single leadership. Now, Trotsky found himself, as soon as Lenin died, isolated. So he was another one of those on the Political Bureau. But he had no support because nobody liked him. They didn't like him any better today than, in fact, they liked him less today than they had liked him when Lenin first brought him on board. Well, why is that? Most of this he brought on himself because he had a personal arrogance to him that was offensive to just about everybody, and he was disliked for that reason. And the other was he had political differences with just about everybody, and so he had no basis for forming an alliance. There's been a lot of talk about Lenin's testament over the years. Now, to understand this letter that Lenin left behind, because he knew he was going to die, it was just a matter of time. A year before his actual death, he had been feeling pretty well. He had gone through a short period of time after his first stroke, and this is the period of time where he seemed to be recovering all of his vitality, and he felt a lot better about everything. Now, that stroke was a pure high blood pressure sort of thing, which today the VA takes care of for millions of people my age every day with 2 things, hydrochlorothiazide and a beta blocker of one kind or another. If he'd had those drugs, he would have lived another 20 years, but he didn't. So that's what they were confronted with. Now, when he died, he left a letter behind, which he had written in those days when he was up to it. And what it was an analysis of the other 6 members of the political bureau. Now, none of those guys could have been very happy about Lenin's caustic analysis of their abilities. But at any rate, this is what he left behind. Now, the 2 that we hear the most about were his evaluations of Trotsky and his evaluation of Stalin. Starting with Stalin, he said that he thought that the party should replace Stalin with somebody of the same capability as a manager, but that he was friendlier, more congenial, and he kind of left it at that. We know that one of the reasons for this is because Stalin had a fight with Lenin's wife about the way Lenin was being cared for in those months prior to the time he started feeling better, and his initial stroke, which had pretty well knocked him out of the picture. Now, in those particular months, the party had said, well, who do we want to use as our contact with Lenin while he's recovering, hopefully, from this stroke? And they said, well, Stalin, of course. He's the one that always hides him when he has to be hidden in Finland, and so on and so forth. So they gave Stalin the task of saying that, trying to oversee Lenin's recovery. Now, Stalin had gone back a few months later and he said, I don't want this job. He says, Ilyich keeps getting mad at me over the smallest things, and I know that the reason is because I keep interfering with what he wants to do based on your orders. What he wants to do is to participate fully in the politics of our time, and the better he feels about it, the more he wants to participate, and I can't blame him. And he says, you have to do something about it. Now, Stalin had already been there to him once because Lenin had asked him for poison to commit suicide. And Stalin had gone to the political bureau and he had said, I'm not going to do this, I don't know what to do. And they had told him to talk Lenin out of committing suicide. Zinoviev said, you have got to make him believe that he owes this to us. We need him there. If nothing else, we need him in the Kremlin, even if we have to turn it into a hospital, because of the symbol. Right now, the Russian people look to him as a symbol and of success. I mean, we've got to have him. So Stalin unhappily continues to accept this responsibility. Well, he goes to the point. The political bureau says, yeah, if you have to give him a special edition of the newspaper, like Pravda, that's just for him, go ahead and do it, whatever it takes. So Stalin did that. He had special issues of newspapers printed up with had nothing but happy times are here again kind of news. But it wasn't long before Lenin caught on to this, or his wife told him, Ilyich, this is bullshit. This is the real Pravda over here. Whatever it was, it led to a fight between Stalin and Krupskaya over that, and Lenin got mad at Stalin because of the names he'd called his wife and one thing or another. So by the time he wrote his evaluation of Stalin, he was in a pretty bad mood. But considering that, it wasn't such a terrible evaluation. Everybody agreed that Stalin was a pushy bastard and that he tended to alienate people and not take always their opinions into account. Now, Lenin said of Trotsky things that were just as interesting. He said, as far as he's concerned, Trotsky's too much of a bureaucrat for his liking. Plus, he was not a Bolshevik most of his life, and this is something that the party has to take into consideration. He lists these. So he's saying that Trotsky's too much of a bureaucrat, not Stalin, but Trotsky, and that he doesn't trust him really because lifelong anti-Bolshevism that Trotsky has. On the other hand, he's saying, but he is a public figure, and as such, he can play an important role for us in international affairs. Anyway, he goes through the other 4 political bureau members, and I'm not going to do that here, but this letter that he wrote evaluating everybody, he gives to his wife to be given to the political bureau when he dies, which he assumes is going to be in the not too distant future. Because he assumes this because he has another stroke right after this period of feeling good in 1923. So by February he's laid low again, and he never recovers from this last series of strokes. They are so severe that Pravda now begins issuing a daily health report on Lenin. Years later, I saw a Russian scholar saying that when this was done over here in Russia because of somebody recently, that had never been done in Russian history before, and I thought, well, how could you say that when Lenin himself had a daily health watch on him published every day by Pravda, because people were so concerned about the fact that he might be quickly removed. And at that point, the latter part of 1923, Russia's starting to come together again for the first time since the beginning of the war in 1914. So by the time Lenin does pass away at the end of January 1924, it's been almost a full 10 years since the good days before the First World War started, and the nation is naturally nervous. So what happened to that letter? Well, Krupskaya brought it to the political bureau, and they all read it, and then they sent it to the Central Committee, and they all read it, and although it's still classified to be read internally, and eventually it was sent to every party member to read. Now this is something that, this is only important because in later days Trotsky and his followers tried to claim that this letter had been suppressed. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. This letter got tremendous attention all through every level of the Bolshevik Party. And when they met to discuss it, the Zinoviev and Kamenev said that Lenin's concerns that Stalin might turn out to be too bossy and so on for the party had failed to materialize. They knew this because they had been working closely with Stalin ever since Lenin's first stroke in 1922, and that they'd had very friendly, amicable relations with him, and that none of the things that Lenin had said were possible had actually come to pass. The political bureau agreed. Nobody voted against it, and so the decision was made to keep Stalin in his job, and the name of the job doesn't really matter. The name of the job by now was General Secretary, but he had many titles. He was also the Commissar for Nationalities and the Commissar of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate. I'm not going to worry you with all of these names, but the important thing is Stalin was the manager, and the Politburo decided to keep him as the manager after they'd had a full discussion of this and after it had been circulated through the entire Central Committee and in fact to every member of the party. So that is how the manager stayed in his management position. We're going to pick this story up when we start dealing with the budgetary considerations, and I want to give you a little bit of a prelude to that so you'll know what we need to be looking for here. Since the first task of the Soviet government is to retain state power, that means the first task of the Soviet government is to build up its military and police forces. Now, the problem is they don't have the money to do this. And in the next 5 years, they're never going to have enough money to do this. It's scarcity for the Army is going to be the number one thing it faces. Now, when you have a scarcity of resources for the Army, this is needless to say, you've got scarcity of resources for everything in the country, but when you have it for the Army, there are a couple of alternatives. One is, well, you could buy a lot of stuff that we need right now to fully equip all of our soldiers. We have a multi-million-man Army still, and but there's a lot of them that don't have uniforms or guns. So we could spend the money on that. This is the school of thought championed by General Tukhachevsky. Stalin, on the other hand, the manager, is saying what we should be doing is building up our military infrastructure so that we can produce tanks and modern equipment as we need it down the road. And we have perhaps 10 years, maybe a little more. Lenin had said, we bought a little time, but not too much. He didn't try to put they didn't really know how much time they'd bought. All they knew was when he was alive, before that early 1922 stroke, it looked kind of like, well, we don't have any immediate enemies in our frontier that can threaten us, not with our huge army. So, we can begin to, we bought some time, but how much time, I don't know. By 1928, Stalin has decided that they might have 10 years if they're lucky. That turns out to be about right. But what his strategy is to build up the steel industry and the military armaments industry, not to spend all that money on a lot of rifles, boots, and so on that can be used right now. This is the beginning of the struggle within the military between these two schools of thought. Tukhachevsky wants to do the first one, and he wants a first strike policy. He says that, and he shows statistics, that the frontline countries against us, which are Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, because by now the Soviet Union's been formed and all of these other republics are now part of the Soviet government, these countries have the ability to mobilize X million number of men with these kind of weapons and so on and attack us first, and we have the long-term ability of being able to get more people into the army, but not fast enough to defeat that kind of offensive. What that means is we have to strike the first blow. So he wants to do two things. Tukhachevsky wants more money to buy stuff for the Red Army right now, and he wants to strike Germany first. So for that purpose, he wants to build a fleet of bombers that would carry the war straight into Germany, as well, of course, as into Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. Stalin says, first of all, we can't build those bombers right now. And secondly, even if we could, it would bankrupt us. And thirdly, what if it doesn't work? We could be sitting there with, what do we do then? If they survive that first strike, which they probably will, where do we go after that? So this is the way for the next 5 years this debate goes down. And what they have to do is figure out some way that they can do all the things they need to do. That's why I'm going to take you in the next lecture, year by year, through the important things that happened in 1923, 1924, 25, 26, 27, 28. Now the answer to all of this, I'll give you right now, because as you go through these budgetary years, you're going to see that no matter how the budget comes out at the end of the year, the Army still doesn't really have what it needs to satisfy any of these programs. Well, what changes everything is in 1928 when Stalin decides to change the nature of Russian agriculture at its very core. Now this is something he'd been building up toward for a couple of years, and we'll go into that in the coming lecture. But the important thing is this. In 1928, 90% of the country is still a bunch of illiterate farmers whose dream is to have an acre of land that they can call their own. Their production is extremely primitive. You have lots of wooden-drawn plows and horses and this kind of thing out there. The peasantry of Russia is an embarrassing albatross around the neck of the Soviet government, which is worth essentially nothing in terms of what it's contributing to the country. Now, up until this time, the Soviet government, like every government, has taxed the farmers, and they're getting a certain amount of produce out of it. But let's say that in 1928, in January, the Soviet government was getting 10% of what the agricultural produce actually amounted to. What Stalin needs is to get 100% of the agricultural produce. If the government owned 100% of whatever Russia was producing in the way of wheat alone, but let's say of all agricultural products, then it would be a tremendously wealthy government. Well, how do you do that? Well, it came about in a new way. It came about in a matter of forced collectivization of the farming masses into And when that was done, and it was completed by the end of 1933, when that was done, what had been an embarrassing albatross around the neck of the Bolshevik government, or any Russian government, had suddenly been transformed into its most valuable asset. Because at the end of collectivization, the Soviet government had a control of 100% of the arable land. And we are going to go through the details of how that was accomplished. But the economic change was important. Russia never had a financial problem after collectivization. The Russian treasury was always full of gold, because now the government is no longer at the mercy of the international capitalist marketplace. It can dictate the price at the international marketplace of the international capitalists. That doesn't mean that they can prevent capitalism from collapsing like it did in 1929 on a global basis, but it does mean that whatever prices they were confronting in 1930, 1931, 32, and so on, that were in the marketplace, they could affect by withholding or dumping wheat onto that particular market. Now, this is of critical importance because it solves the Army's budgetary problems. For the first time, the Army is going to have all the money it needs to do both things: get itself up to par right now and build the military industry that it has to have in order to win the eventual World War. Now, the Bolsheviks are all united on one thing. They know they're going into another World War. It's only a matter of time. Lenin said, "We bought a little time, but just a little. We don't know how much." It's only a matter. Capitalism is not going to let a red government rule over an area, the expanse that goes all the way from Vladivostok to the Polish border. They're just not going to tolerate that. They're coming back at us as soon as they can. They've encircled us with military bases, and as soon as they're up to it, as soon as they can pull it off, they're going to come back at us again. So everybody agreed on that. So within the Soviet government, within the Bolshevik Party, there was no disagreement on that question. The only question was when, not whether. So now what you have going on is a race between the time that the Soviet government finally has the money that it needs to militarize and the beginning of the war. So it starts to get that money, and by 1929 with the mass collectivization of agriculture. And we're going to talk about that collectivization and how it proceeded. But in January 1934, the process was over for practical purposes, and Stalin had won. Now, at the end of January and beginning of February, the party had its most important Congress since Lenin had died exactly 10 years earlier. And they called it the Congress of Victors. And in that period, Stalin, as usual, gave the general report, and in there he outlines all of the things that they've accomplished industrially, and we'll go through that speech in more detail later on. But one thing becomes apparent: there's no more opposition from farmers to what the government wants to do. In fact, the farmers have been turned into the most important economic asset the government has. And with the money that they have produced from agriculture, they've been able to buy all this equipment from the United States, and especially the United States. Even Henry Ford, as anti-Bolshevik as he was quite willing to sell to him for cash up front. And he did. So Stalin was building truck factories and tank factories and car factories with Ford equipment in several different parts of the Soviet Union. Electricity production had tripled in just the first 5-year plan had been completed in a little over 4 years. So what we want to realize is that by 1934, when Stalin gave his report to the Congress of Victors, the problem of getting the army up to speed had finally been resolved, and it had been resolved in this fashion. So what I'm going to do now is stop here. We've given you an overview of what's going to come in the next lecture, and we've kind of brought you up to speed about how the revolution developed into civil war, how the Civil War and anti-imperialist war developed, and then how the Soviet government began to concentrate on the problems of building itself in Russia. Now, at the time, left-wing critics from other countries began to say, Well, how is this Bolshevik government any different from capitalist governments that preceded it? I mean, what are you doing that constitutes building socialism? And Lenin would say, and said several times, we're building socialism because we say we're building socialism. End of story. He doesn't want to pursue that too far. Well, what the biggest problem is that they wanted to inherit a fully developed capitalist mode of production. But what they inherited was a half-assed capitalist mode of production, which had been blown apart by years of civil war, revolution, and the world war that had preceded it. Well, maybe I better do that. Am I still on there? I guess I am. Well, you know what that reminds me of, speaking to the audience again here. Lenin hated cigarette smoking, or any kind of smoking, that he would not tolerate that among other political bureau members. They'd have to leave the room if they wanted to smoke, or at the very least they'd have to open a window and be sure all the smoke went out the window like a bunch of kids in high school. At any rate, I still haven't quite given up the habit myself. And at my age, what difference does it make anyway? But that's something about smoking. And it also reminds me of something I wanted to mention here. When Lenin was in Siberia and he met Viktor Kurnatovsky, when he left to go to Zurich to carry out his mission, which was to get the social democratic leaders in Zurich to agree to publish this newspaper as the core of their party organization, he sent Viktor Kurnatovsky back to see Leonid Krasin in the Caucasus. Krasin, his old friend. And Krepskaya stayed behind, the wife, that is, and she had about 2 to 3 months to run on her sentence before she would be released, and so she stayed behind, and not wanting to have any problems at the very end of her prison term. And she also managed to send 2 more guys from there to the Caucasus, so that she had a role to play besides just waiting for her time to run out. Now, when Kurnatovsky got back to Tiflis, he met up with guys that he'd been robbing banks with before. And some of these people are important. One of them was Michael Kalinin, who would eventually become president of the Soviet Union. Another was Sergo Orzanikets, who would become Minister of Heavy Industry, a man that the Bolsheviks within the party called the perfect Bolshevik, a troubleshooter who would be very important in the government in the late 1920s. And I mention these people now because